Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm David Sproles, the president of the New York School of Interior Design, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event, which is part of our, believe it or not, spring lecture series. If anybody has a connection with Mother Nature, can you please get on the horn and let her know that we're sick of this? But anyway, welcome. We are thrilled to have you here this evening for a lecture by Amy Azzarito, entitled The History Behind the Trends. Amy is the managing editor of the popular blog Design Sponge, which was declared a Martha Stewart Living for the Millennials. That was by the New York Times. It is certainly read by many of our students, alumni, and faculty. Amy stumbled into writing by winning a contest on apartment therapy, another design blog. The prize was to write 5 blog posts a week for $11 each. And I'm guessing that you really didn't support yourself on that alone, but somehow it launched your career in design writing. She went on to earn a master's degree in the history of decorative arts and design from Parsons Cooper-Hewitt program. Amy has published on diverse topics such as the evolution of French cuisine for the book Paris, New York, Design, Fashion, Culture, 1925-1940. She's also written about hand-built homes in the late 1960s as part of the countercultural movement for West of Center, Art and Counterculture Experiment in American Art, 1965 to 1977. Her first book, published last March, is Past and Present, 24 Favorite Moments in Decorative Arts History and 24 Modern DIY Projects Inspired by Them, which ties into tonight's lecture. If you haven't already read it or picked it up, you can do so. It's for sale in the lobby, and maybe Amy will actually sign it for you. Okay. Excellent. If you buy it. Tonight, Amy will take us through the history of some of today's iconic design objects, from inlay furniture, which is currently all the rage in Anthropologie, to the crate and barrel standby, the Windsor chair. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone over to Amy. So welcome.
Thank you for coming. So when I wrote my introduction, I had high hopes with the weather, just to keep talking about the weather a little bit. So I actually wrote, thank you all for coming out on a beautiful spring evening, but that is completely not appropriate for today. So I'm going to start by telling you just a little bit, for those of you interested, just a little bit more about myself and how I got to be the managing editor of the design blog for the millennials, and what I do. So what I do is I write about design on a daily basis. I manage our home tour column, and I write about design history. But to get there, it took me sort of a long while, I would say. I got a BA in journalism, and looking back, I think I was afraid, if any of you are sort of heading out into the world after graduating, I was a little bit afraid to do that. So I moved from Chicago to New York and enrolled right away in a graduate program, so I didn't have to get a real job. And I went to library school, because I figured if I like to research, I'll be a librarian, that'll be great. So when I graduated, I got a position at the New York Public Library as librarian, and I knew it wasn't something that I wanted to do forever, but it paid the bills, and in that way, it was an awesome job, because it allowed me to sort of branch out and experiment and try different things. So if you're stuck in a job that you don't really like, it's the perfect time to try other things. I took screenwriting lessons, I worked as a PA on a movie, I took drafting classes, and all that experimenting made me realize that I wanted to do something with interiors. But after an internship, I realized that for all of you who are interior designers, I didn't want to fight with someone over paint colors. I just didn't. And so, what I wanted to do was learn more about who made paint colors and why they were important, or at least talk about what I liked. So when I discovered that Parsons offered this master's in the history of decorative arts and design, it seemed like the perfect fit. So I went to school full-time, worked to the library full-time, and then I realized that I wanted to do more than just talk about old things. And that was when I entered the contest, where for the prize I got to come up with actually 7 posts a week, so it was a lot of work. And I worked there for a year before moving over to Design Sponge. So For 2 years, I went to school full-time, worked full-time, wrote for blogs on a freelance basis, and then finally when I graduated from school, I moved full-time over to Design Sponge. So, as you heard, I published a book last spring called Past and Present, and the purpose of the book was to demonstrate how you can find inspiration in the past. And this is something that was really important to me. We see a lot of submissions on Design Sponge. When you're looking at hundreds of images, hundreds of submissions, I think we get about 250 on a daily basis, it can sometimes feel like everyone is inspired by the same set of Google image search results. But that isn't the case with the best work. And the best work we see, it feels fresh, it feels new, and there are so many ways to get that and to get inspired. But for me, I was interested in using history as a way to be inspired. And so for the book, I asked artists and designers to look at a moment in history and then to make something inspired by that moment. So that's a little bit about me, a little bit about the book. And so what we're going to do tonight is talk about different design trends, or basically things that we frequently see in design, and then the history behind those particular items. For those of you really excited about inlay, when I was writing this, I decided to skip inlay in favor of a couple other things. So we can talk about that if you want to, but I made an editorial executive choice and skipped it. So the sort of impetus behind the talk tonight is that we all sort of want our homes, or our clients want our homes to tell the story of their lives, right? But it's equally important, I think, to understand the greater story of why these things in our homes, or why they're important. And so tonight is going to be a little bit of a geek out, and hopefully I'll demonstrate that one of the best ways to get inspired is to look back at history. We're all working within a historical context. Everything is a reinvention, but by looking closely at the lineage of design, by noticing how design builds on the movements before it, you can choose where you want to be, what inspires you, and find out more about it, and more of a way to participate in the conversation. Okay, so instead of inlay, starting with indigo. Indigo is one of my absolute favorite trends in the last few years. I don't know about you. Sorry, I was going to get my picture taken while I was drinking water. Everyone else, I think, on Design Sponge, we just fell in love with indigo design pieces. I see it everywhere now. It was the favorite color in the painter's box. It's the basis for the blue-collar worker, and it's the color of Levi jeans. And this is a little proof of our indigo obsession on Design Sponge, some recent indigo items. This is something we did last spring, so if you want any of this product information, you just need to Google Design Sponge indigo obsession. But to understand indigo, I think you have to really imagine a time when color was a luxury. Color itself was a luxury. And I'm not the only one to fall under the spell of indigo. It had an extremely long history, and throughout which the color was revered. So to understand a little bit about indigo, we're going to, it's like looks really ugly on the screen, but travel back to ancient Egypt, where the color blue was revered. And so much so that weavers inserted blue stripes into the borders of plain linen mummy cloths. King Tut's funerary wardrobe included a state robe that was predominantly blue. And sort of an interesting aside, all Egyptian clothing, I don't know if you know this, I didn't know this, that had no hooks, no fasteners, so it was all tucking and wrapping and tying were the sole means of keeping the clothes on the body, live bodies. And this slide is actually an image from the Met. It's an extremely rare, which is why it looks so sad, a rare example of indigo dyed cloth from ancient Egypt. And this is actually a kerchief from King Tut's embalming cache. And linens that weren't used for mummification were sometimes tucked within, buried with the mummy. And it's thought that this was something that he used when he was a child. Okay. This is another example of a modern indigo piece. This is a piece, an indigo dyed furniture piece by Nightwood. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They're a company in a furniture company in Brooklyn. They were in Williamsburg. I think they're moving their studios, but they do really beautiful work. And they love to experiment with dyeing. They do tea dyeing and all sorts of things. So the word itself, indigo, is derived from a Greek term meaning from India. Wow. Indigo cultivation is thought to have existed in the Indus Valley, which is present-day Pakistan, for more than 5,000 years, or 5,000 years ago. They called it Nila, meaning dark blue. And as good things often do, it spread rather quickly. So by the time European traders arrived in Goa in the early 1500s, indigo was only one of the goods that they took home, along with embroidered silks, nutmeg. It's like that. And this is an image of a British-run factory in India, where the low cost of labor in India kept factories unmechanized in spite of the Industrial Revolution. And this is a beating vat where the indigo was oxidized, and it would have apparently produced a very nauseating smell. Not a very fun place to work. So indigo is a color fast, it's a plant-based dye, and it comes from a number of different plants, but primarily found in Indigofera, which is a tropical plant that was cultivated and became a staple agricultural crop. And there are 3 steps to the traditional process of extracting the dye from the plant. This is the second one here. First, the leaves are fermented in a vat. Then the liquid is extracted and oxidized. And from that, a blue solid forms at the bottom of the vat that is collected and then dried. And then in the 19th century, most indigo was made in British-run factories, like the one above. And then this is one of my latest indigo obsessions. I don't know if you're familiar with Rebecca Atwood, but she does these beautiful indigo dyed pillows. I think she's only been in business the last year or so, but she's amazing, definitely one to watch. And then just a little bit about the properties of indigo. It's different from other natural dyes in that it doesn't need a mordant, if you're familiar with dyeing, which is a substance used to set the dye to the fabric. It's insoluble, it's deposited on the fibers as a microscopic particle without needing to form a chemical bond with them. And basically what this means, this is something that remained relatively baffling until the 19th century, but it means that indigo is extremely color fast, which is why when we see King Tut's kerchief, it's still blue. So it can last for centuries, even millennia. But because people weren't sure how it worked, all this folklore developed around indigo. In Bhutan, for example, pregnant women were not allowed near the vat in case the unborn baby stole the blue. And women in Morocco believed that the only way to deal with a particularly challenging vat was to start telling outrageous lies. Convenient, I think. So now moving on to something it's not a trend per se, but it's something that we see everywhere, the Windsor chair. These are a couple Windsor chairs taken from Design Sponge sneak peeks, which are the home tours on the site. I love the red version on the right. And while it may not be the newest of trends to hit the design scene, I think it's having a little bit of a chic moment. Here's an example of Windsor chairs in the Grand Hotel in Stockholm, which was recently renovated from the restaurants. If you're in the market, this is a Windsor chair on the left from Crate and Barrel, and a Windsor chair, an elongated version from West Elm, and I think both retail for $300. Okay, so when you look at the Windsor chair, your first inclination might be to think of a New England country B&B, a sort of Thanksgiving apple pie picking kind of vibe, and that's totally accurate. These chairs are extremely prevalent here on the East Coast, and there's a good reason for that. First, I wanted to address the name of the chair. The reason we call these Windsor chairs is because they were first used, apparently, in the Windsor Castle Garden in 18th century England. And in the slide is someone, I blew it up, it was from the picture on the left, but it's someone being wheeled in a Windsor chair on sort of a dais kind of thing. So not only were they used in the garden, but they were also placed on small boats, and the shape, the round shape, was intended to provide shelter from the wind. They soon became popular garden seats, as you can see here, all throughout the country. They were often painted green or simply left to weather. And then by the 1950s, the English Windsor chair was ubiquitous throughout England, was used everywhere, inns, taverns, libraries, everywhere, meeting houses, you found this chair. So that's basically the name, where they were used. And the next question is, how did these chairs become so popular here on the East Coast? And I have a little clue here on the screen. It's 2 words, Founding Fathers. This Windsor chair form was first used in Philadelphia around the time of the Revolution, and they were such an important part of life in this country that Thomas Jefferson was said to have written the Declaration of Independence in a Windsor chair. Martha Washington had needlework cushions made for her Windsor chairs, and that's Benjamin Franklin sitting in one above the older gentleman, I presume. And one of the major selling points of the chair was its portability. It's light, it's easy to carry from room to room, and it's usually made from 3 different types of wood, both for structural and design reasons. The legs and stretchers were a hardwood, maple, walnut, cherry, and then the seats were sort of a softwood, so they could be carved into that saddle shape that you see. And then the spindles were hickory, because hickory can bend without breaking. And this is why usually the chairs were painted, so to unify all of these different woods. And the main difference between the English and American versions is the splat, that middle piece in the back of the chair. And, while Americans usually have a lower back Windsor. So here's a few different Windsor chair versions, just, for party time conversation. 1 is a fan back Windsor. 2 is a Gothic Windsor for obvious reasons. 3 is the bow back American Windsor. 4 is Windsor brace back. And 5 is a bow back Windsor side chair. Okay, so next trend, wallpaper. I think for the last few years, wallpaper has probably been a big topic of design trending conversations. I think my favorite thing about wallpaper, the wallpaper comeback rather, is how subtly it's used now. So it's not, we rarely see a room that's completely covered in wallpaper and then also has some sort of random wallpaper border. I mean, that just doesn't, thank goodness, really happen anymore. Instead, we usually use it as a sort of focal piece of something in a small room, a single wall wallpaper. This is actually the design sponge offices that we recently did. We did our back wall with wallpaper by SKL, and I think she's in Brooklyn as well, a Brooklyn designer, and she does these amazing digital prints. I can't imagine a whole room done in it. Actually, I don't think you could afford a whole room done in it. I couldn't. So the history of wallpaper itself is an interesting one if you're a bit of a design nerd, as I am, but I wanted to get even more specific today and talk about the history of flocked wallpaper. And I think it may be a holdover from my days as a collector of scratch and sniff stickers and fuzzy stickers, but I love flocked wallpaper and I wish we saw more of it, particularly in small spaces. So before, what's this slide? It's like an old flocked wallpaper. I think this is, I didn't write down where this is from, but I believe this is from the collection at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Before we get to flocked wallpaper, we need to understand what flock is, right? So flock is the name given to a powdered wool that was the waste product of the woolen cloth industry in Britain. And it began to be used on papers in about 1600. And it was supposed to be a less expensive alternative to a cut velvet wall hanging. That was what it was imitating, and it was a pretty big cost savings. So the flocked papers the time were about half the cost of a cut velvet hanging. And the additional advantage was that the turpentine used to affix the flock to the paper was also a moth repellent. So this was a huge bonus at the time when the textiles in your house would have been enormously expensive to reproduce. And creating flocked, here's another flocked wallpaper example. This is a modern one from the Morris Beasties. Creating flocked paper was a multi-step process that involved painting a background color onto a paper canvas. You stencil a design with a slow drying adhesive, and then you finally scatter the flock over the adhesive. And if you're curious to try it, I think Martha Stewart has like a flocking kit. I've actually tried it before. I know for a fact, purchased it. And the real craze for flocked paper occurred from about 1715 to 1745. The fashion was, as all things in the 18th century were, started in France, and it was started even Madame de Pompadour, Louis XV's very trend-setting mistress, had flocked wallpaper in her apartments in Versailles. Here's another one. This one is definitely from the V&A. This one is from 1760 to 1770, and this is actually two flocked wallpapers, one pasted over the other. So in the 17th and 18th centuries, the paper itself wasn't pasted directly to the wall. Instead, it was adhered to linen, which was attached to the wall using copper tacks. I actually love that. I would love to see someone do that in a room. I think it sounds cool. And the showiest flocked paper had a very large pattern repeat. And we're talking about 6 to 7 feet, and was often flocked in multiple colors. Sounds like insanely psychedelic and probably ugly to our modern eye, but it was a big hit. And they were fashionable until the mid-19th century. The decline in popularity was basically because at the time the Victorians became obsessed with cleanliness. So they wanted a wallpaper. Victorians wanted a wallpaper that they could wipe clean, and this just did not fit the bill. Moving on to one of my absolute favorite trends, which is black. As I said, I manage the home tours on Design Sponge, and I think one of the things I've seen a lot in the last couple years is a lot of homes really using black. So these are some of my favorite examples. People are painting everything black: doors, window frames, and they're not at all afraid of completely black rooms. Which is amazing actually when you think about it, because I think a few years ago, if you told someone, I'm going to paint my bedroom black, they would have been like, what? But now people, that's gonna look amazing, and they're really excited, they love it. Black, oh wait, we're jumping the gun with this one. I could have actually organized this entire talk around the color of black, but I decided I wanted to talk about just the moment when black really became fashionable. And we're going to start in the Middle Ages. Actually, before black became fashionable, it became really bad. Previously, for the Romans and in the High Middle Ages, black was a more complex color. There were two sides to black. There was a good black, and a bad black, and they both sort of coexisted in people's minds. And the good black was a black that was associated with humility, with temperance, authority, with dignity. And the bad side of the black was the world of darkness and dead and sin. And in the 10th to 13th centuries, for some reason, basically, the good side of black disappeared. And people became obsessed with black as a sinister color. It sounds like an exaggeration to say, but black was almost entirely associated with the devil. In fact, even the animals associated with Satan were black. Black cats, boar, bears, crow. So this I'm still going to talk about in a second. So what happened? Well, first of all, the Middle Ages ended, so that was helpful. But there was another factor. Black was extremely expensive to produce. In fact, most black fabric was actually more of a grayish or brownish or bluish color. It wasn't this black that we think of today. black dyes, those black dyes were commonly taken from roots, from berries, trying to get some sort of a black. But the best way for a dyer to get a great black color was to use an oak apple, and that's what is on the screen right now. And an oak apple is a small growth, small spherical growth found on the leaves of certain oak trees. And it's the leaves on which insects deposit their eggs. And what happens is after these eggs are deposited, the tree sap exudes this material that gradually envelops that larva and encloses it in a sort of shell. And that's an oak apple. And this oak apple had to be collected before summer. It had to be dried slowly. And it took an enormous quantity of oak apples to produce any amount of viable dye. And the very best oak apples came from Eastern Europe, the Near East, or Africa, so they had to be imported into where we're talking about, which is mostly Italy right now. And so as you can imagine, this dye was extremely expensive to produce. And when things are so expensive, there's usually someone out there who wants to possess it. And in the 14th century, particularly in Italy, there was this the plethora of sumptuary laws, right? About what you could and couldn't have, more often what you couldn't have or what you couldn't wear. And the thought was that money couldn't buy you class. By class, I mean rank. So certain wealthy, extremely wealthy merchants at the time were unable to enter the nobility class. And in order to keep them in their place, they were forbidden the use of specific colors, particularly too lavish reds. They were forbidden to wear the famous peacock blues of Florence, even though they could afford all of these things. So they acquired the habit of dressing in a color not affected by these rules, and that was black. But because they had money, they wanted the best black that the dyers could make. So it allowed them to obey the laws of the time, but still climb the social ladder and look good doing it. Sort of good, I guess. So as the demand for dye increased, so did the skill of the dyers. They became more skillful at developing these beautiful, brilliant blacks. They were able to create a deep, rich black, even using wools and silks, and so it rivaled the most beautiful furs that the nobility could wear or wore. And these beautiful blacks did not go unnoticed by the nobility, or by the rest of society, I should say. They were so beautiful, and black began to become, once again, symbolic of virtue and political authority, so much so that even the nobility classes of Europe took to wearing black. This is like fashion coming from the streets. And then by the end of the 14th century, the fashion for black extended all the way from Italy to foreign kings and princes, and black became the color of choice for princely young men. Black. More black. Just thought that was an ominous little slide. Just take a little drink of water. Okay, so we're going to leave black and move on to pattern. We're going to move on specifically to Native American inspired patterns. This is another one that's been on the scene for a bit. Here are some trade blankets in homes, again, that appeared on the site. And here on the left is a home from the Design Sponge home tour where a couple, you can't really see it very well, but a couple painted a Navajo-inspired pattern in their bedroom wall. And then to the right are two Urban Outfitters. I just think they're kind of hilarious, so I put them on here. One's a surf tote and the other is an iPhone case. And then here are, this is actually some images from my book. This one I did write about in past and present, if you have it. And this is one, it's funny because I keep thinking that this trend is over, but it just keeps popping up. People just love geometrics. And you really, I feel like I still see these everywhere. So where do they come from? So blankets created for trade with Native Americans began to be designed and manufactured by Europeans and the British in the 17th and 18th centuries. And of particular interest to the European traders were beaver pelts and other animal hides, but particularly beaver pelts. I'm sure you're familiar with those like English top hats. So beaver was particularly desirable for its waterproof ability, particularly in London, which makes sense. And in exchange for furs, the traders would offer some sort of small trinkets, steel axe heads, guns, and the first blankets used for trade, the Hudson Bay blankets. And these are the ones with the stripes. The trade was, I don't know, this goes without saying, I think, but the trade was extremely uneven. A ship would bring blankets and goods worth 600 British pounds and then leave with 19,000 British pounds worth of fur. So it was a pretty good deal. Over time, the look of these blankets, the look of the Hudson Bay blankets evolved into, and these striped ones are still on the market now, I'm sure you're familiar with them, evolved into joined by blankets that utilize more design and color and motifs that were popular with Native American tribes. And occasionally, these blankets are called Navajo blankets. And that's more for the fact that their design mimics the patterns found in a Navajo tribe than they were designed by Navajo people. In fact, most of these blankets were most certainly designed by non-Native American designers. Designers who would travel around the country, this time we're talking about tribes on reservations, and would then use the designs that they found in other aspects of the tribal culture in these blankets. The Native American customers were attracted to these blankets, not because they were familiar, but because they were exotic and new. Here's some more pictures. So at this time, we're looking at woolen mill companies like Pendleton who are able to sell their blankets both on and off the reservation. On the reservation, where the Native Americans were attracted to the blanket's quality, to the vibrant colors, and off, where authenticity was a big selling point. I think it's interesting that even today, Pendleton sells half of its products to Native Americans. And actually, the most vibrant colors, the brightest colors, tend to do the best. Early 20th century Americans, as part of their fascination with arts and crafts movement, appreciated the Native American trade blankets as well. So traders would encourage Navajo weavers to create rugs. Doing so, they would show them Middle Eastern rugs for inspiration. This is where it gets complicated. So as white Americans were making blankets that were supposed to look Native American for a largely Native American audience, Native Americans were making textiles that were supposedly authentic using Middle Eastern inspiration tailored for a white American market. So I think, to me, that just is like design history at its best. And I mentioned earlier that this topic was taken from my book, Past and Present, and I wanted to show you how it was translated into a project, because I think it's an interesting example of how to use historical inspiration. And keep in mind that this was not like for a house or a bigger project. This had to be a craft project that people could reproduce. So for this, so in the book, I wrote an essay about the Native American trade blankets, and then I asked the designer of this beautiful ring, Caitlin Motion. Are any of you familiar with Caitlin Motion? Spelled M-O-C-I-U-N. You should definitely know her and know her shop, which is in Williamsburg. It opened 2 years ago. It's an awesome place to go to just see beautiful ceramics and beautiful design goods. So she's a RISD graduate, and she graduated with a degree in textiles. And she initially started her own clothing line, which was lots of geometric shapes in very strong colors. And then she moved to the jewelry design. And I have another example of her work because they're so beautiful. Nice. They're tiny too. When you see this, you're like, oh, it's big, but when you actually see it, it's the tiniest little thing ever. And so I asked Caitlin to take a look at the geometric shapes found in Native American blankets and to do something. And she did these napkin rings. And this was sort of, she had to do something along these lines for the project of the book. But I love this because I think you really get the feeling that she was inspired by the blankets, but rather than simply cut up a blanket to make a tote, as we keep saying in so many stores, Urban Outfitters, she used them as a jumping point to create something totally new. And even the couple who painted that Navajo-inspired mural on their wall, I love that, because it feels like they were taking something. That couple actually found a book of Navajo patterns at Eastern Market, I think, in Greenpoint, and painted it on their wall, so I love that. And that's what I think is really valuable, is incorporating design history into your work in any way you can, whether that's putting Windsor chairs back into a garden or using them as outdoor seating in a client's home, or incorporating Windsor chairs into the home of a client who has British ancestry as a sort of subtle nod to that. I think that's where design history becomes interesting. So I left, I knew we had a small group today, so I left a lot of time for questions. I hope you have some. Do you have any questions for me? None? There you go.
So I work for Abrams.
Oh, hello.
And I am starting a new product line there. Paper products and stationery. And so I'm always, because it's new and everything that I'm working on now is going to come out a year from now exactly. I am constantly wondering about the survival of a trend, you know, what I'm looking at now is catching my eye. It's still going to be interesting a year later, or whether it's too late, if I've already am seeing enough now, you know, that's the indication to move on. And I wonder how you have that design sponge, if you guys have certain barometer or guidelines.
It's hard. I mean, I think we have to remind ourselves that in the field of design that we see way more, and we're looking at things so much more closely than the average consumer or the average person. And so we tend to get sick of the trends a little bit before everyone else does. For example, this Native, I still see, not in the same way, but you see it morph. And I think you have to, I think one of the things you have to pay attention to is are you seeing the design sort of morph in some way that indicates that it might have a long tail? And also where, you know, by the time you're seeing it, well, you're still seeing Native American things that I was gonna say at Target. Like, I feel like metallics, for example, as a trend that I'm not seeing as much of. If anyone wants to disagree, they can. But I'm not seeing as much of metallics as I feel like maybe we were last year, where I would have said, like, this is the metallic trend. I feel like even metallics are a little bit more toned down right now, so it's less so much flash in your face, it's a little more copper. So I think it's just trying to, there's no way really to know except to reassure yourself that you are seeing so much more than anyone who's going to buy those patterns. They're not gonna know, and it's gonna feel fresh to them long after it's sort of, we're on to something else, both by being here in New York and by being in design, I think. We're on top of it. Yeah?
So, here's $1 million question.
Okay.
So for those of us who are designers, who are sitting in the audience,
Yeah.
what trends do you see coming in, being ushered in? Sort of what's your sense of?
I feel like I'm going to say things that are not going to be really a surprise to you because you're seeing them too. So I would say the black and white thing is still big. And if you want to go color, it's gray. But I'm not seeing no real color on walls. I would say that's a big trend. And if there is a color, it's black. And then I still think that we do have a big gallery wall trend. It's not new, but it's still happening, and people are still doing it. So gallery wall with objects as well, you know, and you can go, and I think that's where people want to see the color, is through the artwork, through those gallery walls. And by gallery wall, I'm meaning like the collage things you see. That's been and that's where color is. Or in furniture. Sometimes I'm seeing big pops of color in furniture. So still a lot of pink, still I feel is a furniture color, not a wall color. But, so a big furniture color. Actually, the black hallway that I showed was from this home, this gorgeous in the Catskills, and they had this beautiful bright pink sofa. That's like the only color, but it just looks fantastic. I think people still aren't sick of sheepskin. I think that's still a big thing. So sheepskin on, and a lot of it. So like on every chair in the dining room, and sort of a Scandinavian kind of feel, I think, is what we're getting with that. So a lot of black and white, a lot of sheepskin, colored furniture. What else? I mean, I think copper is kind of the metallic of choice right now, I would say. The copper is sort of hard. I feel hardware fitting, like using your garage, like the hose for your garage thing as like the sinking. People love that. I don't know why, but I feel like that's like a popular thing right now. And I also feel like this is not something that's a trend, but maybe it is a trend, is really wanting to personalize the space. So it's finding a way to bring travel in a unique way. So whether that's with a really cool maps that maybe have little flag pins on them. Maps are still big, but I would say they're not as big as they were a couple years ago. I mean, they're always big, but there was like a moment where everyone wanted like tons of maps. It's kind of passed a little bit, but I do feel like finding a way to be really unique and personal. So it's really some sort of vintage element, some sort of travel souvenir, some rug from Morocco, I don't know, found on Etsy or something like that. So, yes.
I have two questions. One is, outside of New York, like, what is your personal opinion of what, like, top 3 design cities are, like, influential? And the other one is, how important do you feel like being environmentally responsible is important to people when they, from a design perspective, like, kind of project?
I'm going to answer the last one first just because it's in my head right now. I don't think environmentally conscious design is important enough to be a selling point anymore. So I think it's just something that's a given more than it's an exciting, big selling point. And depending on your client. I mean, if your client is like, everything must be. But I think it's sort of taken for granted that you're going to do the best job you can to find things that are fair trade and sustainable, and I think that has a lot to do with the people's desire for recycled things, for that authenticity. That's a big trend. Authenticity, which comes from like, these are my barnwood floors, you know. So they're like already sustainable. Like you don't need to like bamboo it. But as far as design cities, maybe outlier is I love the work of Jessica Helgerson, who's in Portland. So I would sort of say Portland because of her. If you're not familiar with her work, she's amazing, and she does do homes here on the East Coast as well. But I love her work. And then after that, to be more like design city, I would say LA. And there's that sort of totally different vibe. You can look at, there's some great blogs. Morgan from the Brook House writes a great blog in LA about LA design. And it's a totally different look. It's a little more mid-century modern. It's a little more, I think there's like a new name for it. It's like, this is not it, but it's like Mexican chic or something. Mexican is in the title. It's like a new, No, it's not hacienda, it's Mexican. I remember because I was like, that's weird that they're just saying Mexican. But it is like a hacienda style, but it's more like they take the Mexican. It is that. I mean, that is part of Southern California culture, so that makes sense. But Morgan does that really well. So I would say, you asked me for 3 or 2. So I would say LA. I would put Portland in there. I would actually say Austin. I think cool things. Are you going to Austin? You're going to Austin? Ooh, I love Austin. I think cool things are happening there. I think there's some great people. Allison Fox is in Austin, and she's amazing. She does beautiful rugs and everything. She did a line for, I think, West Elm not long ago. So I would say cool things are happening. And everyone I know keeps doing pop-ups in Austin from New York. So that's a good indication. So those cities. Portland, LA, Austin. They all have better weather than us right now. Even this year, I think they do. Yep.
So you said in New York we are very much ahead of the game and staying on top of things, being fast-paced.
Mhm.
I'm sure very true. How do you go about making sure you stay on pulse? Like, what is a day like for you to make sure you don't miss something that you should know being a leader in the design field?
That's a good question. I think it's a lot of reading, and being aware of blogs. But I think the thing that we have in New York is street fashion, store windows, museums. And so really getting out there to see design, forcing yourself to go to events, like this one, good job. But forcing yourself to go to events when you don't really want to. So going to see gallery openings, going to see design shows. And we're lucky too because all of, some of the flagships of big stores are here in the city, so you can really go in and see what they're doing. I mean, I think as far as box stores, West Elm has been killing it lately with their design. I mean, absolutely killing it. And they're in Dumbo, so you're super close to even see, or if you have a client, to call them up and see what they're working on. They're all super nice over there. So I really think it's just getting out there and trying to be aware of what you're seeing, which sometimes can be sort of easier said than done. But I think reading New York Mag does a great job in their design section. Fast Company is awesome. They have a great design section and great articles and do a phenomenal job. Of course, you should read the New York Times, but sometimes I don't feel like they're ahead of the game, but they're a good place to go. So those are my. Yep.
So you mentioned that you had about 200 submissions a day.
Right.
Is that selling your product, or just like public relations, press releases, or and how do you sit through and what do you look for? That's a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot. It is a lot. I just did a bunch of homes. I think I had like so many homes to look through. So it's that. It's people sitting in their houses. So submitting their house. So it's either a designer or an individual submitting their home. People who have products to sell, books to sell, and PR people. Mostly, we don't pay very much attention to press releases. I would say what makes the biggest impact, hands down, on anything, product, home, is photography. So if you're going to invest in one thing for your project, it's the photography. The ugliest space in the world can look amazing if you have a good photographer. And for us, I don't really, just to be honest, I'm not in the space in real life. I honestly don't even care what it looks like in real life. I just care what the photo looks like, So, and that's because that's what I'm writing about, is what the photo looks like, and it's not what the space looks like. And so a lot of times that's where people make the mistake. They're trying to show me what the space looks like, so they're trying to do some big whole room shot, and it looks terrible. So you're trying to decide, and for products it's the same thing. Like, what does it look like? It's a design site, so what does it look like? And I think that's the by far the biggest thing. And then of course it's like nice if you write a nice email, not too long, those things. But if you have a great photo, that's gonna sing louder than anything. Yes.
Rough number, how many people look at the website daily?
Daily. I think daily is about 100,000 uniques.
Wow.
So yeah. And then it's I know the monthly more. It's like a million something a month, I think. So yeah.
Sorry, with the submissions, do you find that people send it more you digitally or like physically? Or
Oh, digitally. Yeah, we don't want anything physical for the most part. Most people don't, and don't send too big files. Like I don't know why people. This is like, but if you're sending to like an online publication, they don't need a high res photo. So it's you don't want to send it too small either, like a tiny 80 by 80. But it does just not too big. Yeah, but totally digitally. Don't pay for printing or whatever. Yes.
is there a historical moment that you would personally like to see come back and influence design?
That's a good one. I think that I would like to see, which I hope we do, more of a return to like real craftsmanship rather than people like who have been doing something for a year. And I love that for its place, but I would love to see like a return to that. I would love to see people start doing like boiserie again, and that's never gonna happen because no one's ever gonna start carving like little flowers in wood. But I would love to see, just like subtly, I don't know. I would love to see that. But I would love to see, I think a lot of times, and this kind of was a trend, we've been seeing people do things sort of that a pretty rough look. And that's great, and it is super popular now. It's definitely a trend, rough looking things. That unless it's a trend. Things that look kind of rough, looks like, 5-year-old could have made it, but they didn't, so. But I would personally like to see kind of a return to craftsmanship. Like, for example, I love the work of Frances Palmer. She's a ceramicist who's in Westport, Connecticut, and she makes beautiful vases. I should call them vases because they really are vases. They're not vases. But she is an amazing artist. So there are those amazing craftsmen alongside people who are like, found a great PR niche and have been doing it for a couple years.